embedded and embodied connection with the natural world. H.P. Lovecraft seems to also advocate the importance of the body and experience as a foundational point of understanding and terror. This is further explored in the geographic and geological descriptions Wilmarth gives of Vermont. He states that I knew I was entering an altogether older fashioned and more primitive New England than the mechanized, urbanized, coastal and southern areas where all my life has been spent. This section alone contains a number of possibilities for environmental criticism, but perhaps most interestingly for this study is the separation of urban spaces and the idea of wilderness. Within the context of Lovecraft, though, there seems to be a sense that as attractive as this natural rural landscape is, the urban environment somehow provides protection from ancient forces lurking deep within the Vermont hills. The sublime sensory effect Vermont has on Wilmarth is much like the existential dread felt by the confrontation with an infinite cosmos. In The Whisper in Darkness, Lovecraft seems to use embodiment as a technique to enhance the sense of cosmic dread, as well as a way to synecdochically reference the same feeling of overwhelming or purposelessness his characters often feel in the face of an infinite and uncaring universe. Moreover, this sense of an embodied connection of place and experience flows into the idea of local or traditional knowledge. Within the fiction of Lovecraft, there appears to be a recurring theme of rustics or locals having terrible cosmic knowledge or awareness unknown to more educated scientific minds. This is evident in The Whisper in Darkness through the fact that local legends and the mutterings of so-called ignorant rustics already speak of the impossible reality found within the story. Wilmarth, the story's narrator, laughs at what he sees as their mythological explanations. He notes that different cultural groups have different understandings of the beings, but they all know that they exist. And additionally, they all unanimously agree that the beings are not from this earth. And by the end of the story, we know this to be the case. These rural rustics might not have the academic background to argue for the existence of these beings in terms that someone of learning like Wilmarth would accept, but they do have a local knowledge and understanding embedded within the folklore, experience, and history of their home place. It is another type of embodied and regional understanding that appears so often in Lovecraft in the form of Indian tales, bizarre myths, cults, and the mysterious ancient texts like the famed Necronomicon. And making the landscape of New England strange, Lovecraft also turns the pastoral knowledge of its rural inhabitants towards the providence of hideous cults and terrible ritual from a time beyond memory. The color of the space is particularly noteworthy for its emphasis on the significance of local knowledge. Like The Whisper in Darkness, the color out of space takes place in a rural setting where an alien menace has disrupted the natural way of things. The entire story is essentially about the narrator seeking out the local knowledge and history about the place after having had an unsettling experience. It is in many ways just a fantastic tale of regional peculiarity. The most significant relevant passage comes towards the end of the story. The rural tales are queer. They might be even queerer if city men and college chemists could be interested enough to analyze the water from that disused well, the gray dust that no one seems to disperse. Botanists too ought to study the stunted flora on the borders of that spot, for they might shed light on the country notion that the blight is spreading, little by little, perhaps an inch a year. Whereas scientists are usually employed to debunk the bizarre reports of fantastic events, in this case, the events would be rendered even stranger with scientific study. This suggests a sort of confirmation that the local experience and knowledge of some rural people can be ahead of or more in touch with reality than the scientific and academic realms of society. Perhaps this is because they are not bound up by an intellectual understanding of how things are supposed to be. The tale suggests that scientists of all stripes should descend upon the heath to study and give a proper, eloquent report of what the locals already know. Perhaps the most obvious ecocritical thread in the color of space, though, is that of environmental perversion, or the sanctity of the natural order. As the unnamed narrator stumbles upon the blasted heath at the beginning of the story, he observes that upon everything was a haze of restlessness and oppression, a touch of the unreal and the grotesque, as if some vital element of perspective or chiaroscuro were awry. The sense of environmental degradation in the story is apparent. It is an obvious point of exploration in and of itself, but in mentioning chiaroscuro, or the interplay between light and dark, the narrator emphasizes that beyond mere environmental decay, there is also a perversion of physics as we understand them. The meteorite has poisoned the soil, water, and the very laws by which we make sense of the world around us. In living by life, some bioregional theory and practice, Jim Dodge argues that bioregionalism holds that the health of natural systems is directly connected to our own physical and psychic health as individuals and as a species. This story, through the meteorite's effects, presents much the same ecological link between the health of the environment and its natural systems and the physical and psychological health of humanity. As the water and soil of the gardener's farm becomes poisoned, the meteorite and the mysterious gaseous being it carried are responsible for a number of unnatural effects. Through the disruption and perversion of the natural environment, or environmental systems around the gardener's farm, the meteorite also inevitably perverts the gardeners, because the human and environmental existences are inextricably linked. The theme of environmental perversion comes up in the lurking fear, where the soil is covered by a fetid and corrupt vegetation, a poisonous mold representing a type of horrible separation of the earth, as well as the call of Cthulhu, where the impossibility of Rylies or Rylays, or however that's pronounced, architecture, is a perversion of our understanding of geometric space, and therefore a disruption of our sensuous connection to and understanding of the world. Like the geometry in the Call of Cthulhu, the environmental perversion is further emphasized in the color of space through the sensory disruption it causes. By being incongruous with the embodied knowledge of the human existence, the meteorite inevitably causes terror. For example, the effects of the meteorite have disrupted the natural sensory connection between experiential understanding of the production of fruit and the link between sight and taste. Furthermore, no wholesome colors were anywhere to be seen except in the green grass and leafage, but everywhere were those hectic and prismatic variants of some diseased and underlying primary tone, without a place among the known tints of the earth. Working somewhat within the tradition of the grotesque, Lovecraft makes his color or shade detectable by the characters in the story. However, it is just strange and impossible enough for it to cause psychological disturbance. The plant life has been tainted and rendered alien and offensive. Likewise, the experience of processing and understanding colors and shades has been made disturbingly foreign. Once one is alienated from their sensory perception by incomprehensible cosmic forces, they are often left paralyzed with a sense of an existential and cosmic dread, overcome by an apparent purposelessness of human existence in the face of such an infinite and uncaring universe. Cosmic horror is Lovecraft's major claim to fame. However, another way to emphasize the terror in his fiction comes from unseating humankind from its tiny region where it is the apex predator, and placing it within the greater ecology of an infinite cosmos. This is generally represented through the ancient vastness of the whirling cosmos. The ecology of the universe, of which we are but a small part, also represents the earthly ecology in which we are inextricably linked. What would it mean for the works of H.P. Lovecraft if humanity was already more ecologically conscious and had a cultural and conscious perception that wasn't based on individualism or the inherent superiority of humankind? If we already considered ourselves as merely part of a greater biotic whole rather than its center, would the cosmos seem so diminishing and terrifying? If the cosmic ecology can be said to reflect the earthly ecology, then how does that reflect on our own environmental practices? If the lack of care these older and more advanced beings continually show us throughout Lovecraft's fiction cause us nothing but terror, we should consider being more empathetic and compassionate towards the other forms of life that we tend to treat as nothing more than liquid inventory to be processed for monetary gain. It would seem that in this light, we are the dispassionate old ones who view other life as inconsequential and deserving of our cruel tyranny. In expressing the vast, terrible potential of the cosmic, Lovecraft has made us the ants beneath the magnifying glass. Ultimately, this essay does not attempt to make any extensive conclusions regarding H.P. Lovecraft's writings about place, but hopefully it has opened up some possibilities regarding the way his works may be engaged with. Ecocritical scholarship has made great strides in horror and science fiction over the last decade, but to my knowledge has been somewhat neglected mode of study when addressing H.P. Lovecraft. Hopefully this essay, as modest as it may be, can help spark some ecocritical dialogue around this author who himself is so bound up in and concerned with place. Within literature, genres and texts themselves are ecosystems that are environmentally embedded. With that being said, the concept of place also gestures in at least three directions at once: toward environmental materiality, towards social perception and construction, and towards individual affect or bond. In my brief ecocritical study of Lovecraft, I would argue that a combination of the second and third directions are the most fruitful directions of applicable critical study. The second direction is particularly useful when applying a regional framework to Lovecraft's fiction, and the third when focusing on the horror aspects of dread, the cosmic, and environmental perversion in his fiction. Lovecraft himself noted that The Whisper in Darkness was in part inspired by the general impression of weirdness in the Vermont landscape he gained during a fortnight's visit near Brattleboro in 1928. Based on the writer's own affective relationship with the Vermont landscape, he structures a tale around a setting that is very much wrapped up in affect and feelings of the sublime and mysterious. The horror found in H.P. Lovecraft's fiction is very much about what cultural geographer Yi-Fu Tuan calls topophilia, or the affective bond between people and place or setting. Lovecraft's literary settings extend beyond the knowledge, or beyond the knowable bounds of time and space, and are an integral aspect to achieving the sense of infinite dread that the cosmos provides. At this stage, I find it hard to make the argument for Lovecraft as some sort of early 20th century environmentalist, though his writings mentioned previously, as well as his travel literature like A Description of the Town of Quebec, are a rich area for ecocritical scholars to craft criticism focused on place and the ecological meanings found therein. Thank you.
Time for all of about one question, if anyone has a burning need to ask something.
I need my primary source.
And, yes.
For Alex, as well as seems like Nicola and it's sort of assumed surrounding knowledge or...
Wait, I'm sorry, would you mind speaking up just here? I'm not very good at hearing.
So it seems that Hegel and Derrida seem to assume a sort of connection between signifier and signifier. It seems that, especially in public good, where there's this connection between dragons to an object that that it is assumed to be a break, especially in the transit. You have this new translation, but it's not quite there. Do Hegel or Derrida account for an assumed sort of non-substituting language where it is not assumed to be signifier or signifies?
Oh, jeez.
And you have about 30 seconds.
Yeah, go for it. Start.
Yeah. At one point, Derrida does bring up this idea of mark, as in there's this kind of unspoken relationship between signifier and signified, where language is unnecessary. But the minute language is brought into the equation, as is necessary for human beings, the mark becomes shunted somehow. So he does account for this idea that there is a relationship there, but almost as if it's very much fleeting. It kind of confirms this idea of objective reality, but our relationship to it is very nebulous.
I honestly, I hate to say this, I pulled Hegel into my lecture. My understanding of Hegel is limited, to say the least. So I don't know how to, I'm sorry, I mean, we should talk afterwards.
That's always the right answer. Okay, our next panel is the last one of this year's Emerging